Okay, this is a message for Nikki Brooker. Thank you so much for uploading that video. I find it very interesting to hear me crunch so much law into such a short segment. The primary points I want to clarify is that it might be easily presumed that the statements in that video were true and accurate and correct to the best of my knowledge if I don't post some kind of response and reply. What I've found in relation to Assange's personal case in Sweden, I followed my trip in England on to Sweden again and met with a criminal law researcher who helped clarify many things, and I continue to study the case there from Sweden. And what I found is that Julian Assange's defense website was citing a neo-Nazi promoted by Rick Downs, who is Rick Stepp, who Julian has relied on consistently since the scandal in Sweden began to promote lies and defamation and attacks and unsubstantiated complaints against the women for reporting rape, which is a form of retaliation. And anyone who reports a crime should not face retaliation for reporting the crime. And given that they were both engaged in, one was actually a press secretary for WikiLeaks and one was volunteering with WikiLeaks, that they experienced this kind of potentially quid pro quo sexual harassment imperative there in Sweden should be very concerning to us, and that Julian Assange has escaped any kind of further investigation by fleeing Sweden, processing it through the British courts at great delay and great expense, and then now is taken refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy. It's important to look at rape victims' rights and what is actually going on in terms of the leveraging of the attempted Ecuadorian sovereignty over the human rights of women not to be raped. So I thought I'd bring that forward, and there are many other issues that pertain to how this case should be viewed, and I think looking at Julian Assange's early emails from 1996 through 2007, I believe, with John Young on Cryptome.org has been very interesting to me because he points out that Julian Assange was speaking of possibly fleecing the CIA for money for advanced propaganda projects to instigate something like the Arab Spring. And if you've studied anything about how the CIA was involved in coups and uprisings and sponsorship of student intellectual groups or discussion groups or political groups, this could be kind of where WikiLeaks falls categorically, but that part isn't so important to me as what I saw to be some character and or cultural problems with racism and sexism in his emails. What I noticed specifically in February is that there had already been a very targeted misogynistic element within the way that the Assange team handled the case from the lawyers on down, and I had been writing letters for over a year to try to correct, remedy, and reason with them and help them have a different perspective, because I have long been a fan of gender equality measures and studied Norwegian gender equality and Swedish gender equality as very, very helpful and viable ways we could build a better future for women globally. So my participation in and interest in the case was also partly with those reservations, that I liked the international aspects of it, but I was very appalled at their handling of it. But I was willing to kind of go along and deal with it and try to reason with them. So behind the scenes, I've been sending letters to try to remedy what I saw as very grievous acts of misogyny and attacks on defamatory attacks on people who shouldn't be attacked. So with that in mind, a part of why I was there was to try to get through to them. If I expressed like a lot of support for the overall project of information freedom, but I expressed complete disgust for any kind of discriminatory or harassing treatment or promotion of the violence to women, that becomes kind of difficult for them, because what it has seemed like in the last 6 months is that now that they now they require a mandatory misogyny, and the misogyny's just gotten worse, and maybe the good people have left, or maybe my own mind has expanded, but I've seen a lot of deterioration in the case. Victim attacks I heard in England, and then the very like compromising situations even too, with say the first batch of British lawyers coerced testimony from Sweden. That's been admitted on many angles. Swedish counsel didn't agree with how English counsel had configured the case. We had multiple figures like Sven Erik Alhem and Bjorn Hurtig disagreed with Mark Stevens' interpretation of, oh, we can just blame feminism for rape charges, which it was very farcical from the second I read this outlay of this English construction of the case in 2011. So what we found, I basically did a lot of kind of, I mean, I wouldn't call it undercover exactly, but emails, and just got a whole bunch of new information since we talked, and that's included information that Julian Assange's lawyers were compromising the Swedish expert opinion's privacy by feeding private emails written by Goran Rudling to Rick Downs, who recommended the neo-Nazi that was on Julian's website, and who also has threatened to sue Al Burke, who was trying to get a better translation of the police report in Sweden. So it's kind of like a lot of, but it's beyond pettiness. It's actually very extremely inappropriate kinds of attacking behavior and misconduct in the handling of the case, and that has been further compounded by the grievously sexist and disturbing statements from the Ecuadorian foreign minister that the rape charges are hilarious. So I love the video that you made, Nikki, but I feel very much ethically inclined to state that I disavow the attacks on the victims. I disavow the attacks on Swedish gender equity and Swedish law, and that I think we had all hoped for some kind of peaceful and equitable resolution to this case, and we were falsely trusting in the British judicial system, which has now put us in a very funny situation in regards to leveraging state sovereignty, myth of sovereignty over the human rights of women to have a fair and speedy trial, or investigation and trial, which may be the case when Julian arrives in Sweden. So that the delay has put us in some hot water. And in regards to the neo-Nazi that was cited by Julian's website, I wrote many letters to get the neo-Nazi off. I was very personally offended, deeply personally offended, and eventually they removed it. They said they did, and then they didn't. Weeks later, I'm like, would you guys please deal with this? But I think then I used it as a leverage point to say, okay, you can see why it's not a good idea to have a neo-Nazi on your website. Can you see why it's good also not to have misogyny on your website? But they couldn't, so that was kind of like talking to a wall at a certain point. And then they got really vicious against the women. The guy who recommended the Nazi was stalking and harassing the victim on Twitter a few days before the final court announcement, and then the promotion of a book which basically spoke of redefining rape as free love and Swedish sex was really disturbing when WikiLeaks stooped this new low. And then I realized through gobs of research that I was pretty dismayed and kind of like, what's going on here with their involvement with Russia Today, which was instantly panned by the British media as a sellout to the Vladimir Putin regime. Putin killing loads of journalists. So ethical and moral compromises abounded. And then even on the Russia Today segments, Julian refused to interview women, and it was very much interpreted to be a reaffirmation of his sexism and the sexist essay of his case. And then he interviewed a famous jihadist who also recommends Sharia and violence to women. and that was really unfortunate. That was about May. So, with those things in mind, it's not been very clear-cut at all. If anything, I perceived it as a slipping of his wits, the stress of his facing imminent espionage trial in the U.S. or some kind of extrajudicial measures has kind of caused his judgment to falter, although there were signs of it as early back as in 2011 when he was bragging about taking money from a famous pornographer, Larry Flynt. I found that to be indicative of his lack of PR savvy in terms of how capable he was of imagining women's rights in an international context. And I think even with all those things, if those things should surely be taken into consideration, it does not negate brilliance in some regard or technological respect, or the bonding that some people had with persons surrounded with that case. But overall, it can also be interpreted many other ways from an American context, whether or not it was a targeted false flag operation or something hurtful or something that was both a false flag and will also be interpreted as espionage by various factions of various agencies of U.S. super dominant power, perhaps. So that's kind of interesting to me, like that deeper philosophical mystery of is he being used, and if so, by whom, and who is disposing of him. But in the meantime, I think paying heed to the human rights of the women in Sweden will be the best thing for everyone. So I hope that there's a speedy resolution to that.